over some of the terminology talked about yesterday in the case that you weren't here. Reading profile sum graphs, going to go over that. The logic that the software uses, especially with those auto set points, manual adjustments, when and why we would use them. And then we'll do some poll questions in practice. So if you were here yesterday, you've already seen this. But when these are the terms you really want to think in when you're looking at adjusting profile sums on crep X and what that all looks like. So saturation, that's when our profile sum is above that blue or green line. It depends on how you look at it, but it's above that top line on our profile sum graph. That's typically what we're going to call saturation in our field. Field capacity is right at that blue line. The maximum amount of water that field can hold after that free drainage occurs. Refill point is just that trigger to irrigate. That's always kind of going to be more of a personal preference type of thing. It's also called management allowable depletion. That's what you will hear from university extension classes. If you ever do one of those, they're going to refer to it as allowable depletion, not the refill point. And then permanent wilting point, that is when your crops are really going to start to hurt. I know Jason touched on this yesterday in our Soil 201, but I just want to remind you guys again, because I've heard it a couple times, like the refill point is not ever going to be your permanent wilting point. I hope we never get there. We use the software to avoid getting there. But this diagram just kind of, it's a summary essentially of what that would look like on the graph. Anything to add, really? Okay. I will let you touch on this one.
So Jason talked about this yesterday, but we want to make sure and establish this as like some baseline knowledge for understanding what we're measuring, how the graph is built, which really drives where we're setting the field capacity and our refill points. So we are measuring the portion of our soil that is water, and that is by volume, right? So total volume, so taking that bucket of soil and breaking down those things inside that bucket and asking ourselves, what portion of that volume is water? And so in this example, volumetric water content being expressed as 20%, a lot of times you may see like university stuff might be expressing it as 0.2 or 20% or 2.4 inches per foot. All mean the same thing because you're measuring what portion of that profile is water compared to the rest, which would be your soil, organic matter, mineral matter, and hopefully the rest of your pore space.
Questions on volumetric water content? This is just a quick slide, really basic on the main points of a profile sum graph. So that blue or green line, I can never tell it's blue or green, but that top line is your full point, essentially the maximum water holding capacity of that soil. You can see to the right of the screen, I labeled it as allowable depletion. So you're allowing that soil to deplete or the plants to deplete that moisture down to that refill point, which is going to be your trigger to irrigate. And I'm sure most of you know this, but on the bottom there, you've got your dates. And then on the left, you have essentially volumetric water content. Anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, some white papers you'll see that same like blue bracket on the right that's labeled. You'll see that term also be available water or I'm sorry, what am I trying to say? Not water available water, but readily available
Yeah.
water. That's the term. So you've seen that on university studies and things like that, where they say readily available water. Well, it's basically just referring to your full to refill or wherever your minimum allowable depletion is.
Question.
Question here is, what is the resolution of volumetric water content as measured by a CropX sensor?
If you look at your individual sensor graph and you hover and drag your mouse over that graph, it's going to show you in the tenths of percentage points. So does that mean that we're confidently telling you that there's a difference between 45.6 and 45.7? No. We don't need to worry about that to that level of detail because you're talking about probably like, hundredths of an inch or less, or thousandths of an inch of water, probably. So,
Great question. So reading profiles, some graphs. Again, just one of the basic things you should know as you're glancing through all of your fields. You can hover over any point on that profile sum line, and you'll get this little box that's highlighted in that red circle. With the 3 points, profile sum, refill, and full point, you'll have the time and the date. And so I just put a little blurb on the bottom of the slide here. What can we learn just from this small piece of information? The way I would read this in my head is on July 8th at 7 a.m., the sensor was measuring a total of 6.1 inches. So your profile sum, that top bullet point in the square, in the 36-inch profile. In this case, this was a third-party sensor hooked up to our telemetry. It was 36 inches long, which that 36-inch profile would be considered our profile sum. The grower's refill point, or his trigger to irrigate, is 5.32 inches, and the full point or field capacity is 7.3 inches. Questions?
I would just add to that my brain also immediately goes to, well, how much room do I have between my full and my refill? And you've got right about 2 inches. So that, I always kind of use the bucket term, right? It's like, well, that's how big my bucket is to work with when it comes to managing irrigation. I've got 2 inches to work with.
Do you want to touch on auto set points?
Yep, sure. So we talked about this in one of the breakout sessions, but from a basic level, we have coached this feature to watch for trends with the data to identify field capacity. And we can show examples of this later, but basically, at some point, moisture peaks. And that point at which that moisture peaks and by definition, what field capacity is where the soil is holding the moisture, not at saturation where it could lose it to gravity. But that point at which the soil is holding that moisture, we're watching that trend happen on that graph, which generally is going to be represented by the beginning of root activity or where that flattening out phenomena occurs at the top of the graph after a wetting event. Obviously, so good set points are dependent upon a good install. That's where it all starts. We need good data.
I'll just add a point to that. Good set points depend on a good install. You should be able to tell pretty much right away when you get that initial, like, good news, your sensor is online, like this is what your VWCs look like. You should be able to tell from that text message or notification if you're in the ballpark of a good install or not. If you're installing in sand, if you're installing in just a loamy sand and you're getting VWCs around 3%, that's not right. And so that would be an indication. Another point for yourself as you're going out and doing those physical installs in the spring, know the soil, know approximately what VWCs go with what soil textures, and use that as a check when you get those notifications. That'll really help give you confidence that those auto set points are going to get off to a good start.
Great point. Yep. And so when that attempts to find that full point, one small change compared to last year is that it's going to be doing it within the first 6 hours, whereas last year that would have taken up to 48 hours. The reason that we decided to do that was because of that new moisture offset feature, which I talked about in our advanced session. And that was that feature that Taha talked about, where we updated the let CropX decide versus tell me if this is full or refill. So that's what I mean by the moisture offset. So we moved that initial set point timing down to 6 hours because we want that input that you provide with the moisture offset input to be relevant. And so the challenge last year was with waiting 48 hours is you could have a wetting event happen between the time that you installed it and the time that the first field capacity was calculated. And so then your user input that you provided us was sort of like null, like it was invalid because we had a wetting event that happened between when you installed it and when we set those initial set points. So we've narrowed that down. What that does mean, though, is that if for some reason you do happen to use a lot of water during the install, you might see some of that still tapering off within that 6 hour window. And that might be something to sort of just check on once the auto set points have set their lines already.
Questions?
Why is it a 2-inch bucket and is this on all soil types?
Can you repeat that?
Why is it a 2-inch bucket and is this on all soil types?
So I think the question was referring to that example graph that you showed where the full point was like 7.2 and the refill was 5. Okay, so 7.3 and 5.3. When I said a 2-inch bucket, I'm talking about the distance or the number of inches between full and refill. So if I get a 4-inch rain, how much water can I add to my profile on July 8th, where she has her cursor? It's currently at, we'll just say 6.2. And my full point's at 7.3, I can really only add 1.1 inches of water to my profile. I'm full at that point, and if I know I'm going to use between 20 and 30 hundredths a day based on the forecast, you know about how many days you're going to be to refill. So if you start thinking about like what the distance is between full and refill, or the distance between what my current moisture is and refill, then you can start to think about how many days do I have before I need to irrigate, and all that stuff's being done for you on some of those features that we were looking at earlier, like the days to refill in the table view.
Was there a second part to that question? No? Okay. Yeah, that's what I want to touch on. So that is going to be different for every single field based on number one, water holding capacity, right? And number two, what your refill point or allowable depletion is going to be set at. And we'll touch on the general reasoning to where to set your refill point at in a little bit here, but no, not every field is set to 2 inches of refill. It really depends on your soil and allowable depletion.
So as we mentioned, so we've sort of talked through that initial set point that's going to continue to adjust over time as you move through the season. If you establish a new high, and we have identified a new higher field capacity, it's going to move. As we mentioned on the what's new, that should trigger a notification to you to be like, hey, there's a new field capacity. You can always go back and check it at that point. But I guess just keep that in mind that like we had some questions last year. It was mid to late season, and I think finally somebody got some rain that they hadn't gotten prior to that, and a new set point was established. I don't know what to tell you other than your soil held more water. So we were underestimating field capacity before. And until you establish that new high, we didn't know that on that particular field. I would say, that type of scenario is probably only going to come into play 2, 3, 4, 5% of the time. I think that's pretty rare. Most of the time, you're going to be able to identify field capacity within, a few percentage points of where it really is.
And if you are going to the same field year after year, installing in the same area, look at the history from the years prior. You'll get a pretty good idea about what field capacity is. John touched on this a little bit yesterday. Field capacity can change. It does change. It doesn't drastically change, however. Like it's not going to change 2 inches over what the sensor has probably identified at that point. Am I right? For the most part, yeah. I would say no, because it is measuring soil water storage, not necessarily plant water movement. So it's a soil characteristic versus like a plant characteristic. Are you in?
Yeah, I think the thing that's going to change that long term is, building organic matter, increasing your water holding capacity. I mean, that's what's going to change, but it's not going to be a short term thing.
Yeah, the comment is, will it change with your root zone? And the answer is yes. If your root zone, or if you are using the root zone graph to only account for 20 inches of the profile sum, yes, your full point is going to change because 20 inches of soil does not hold as much as 36 inches does. If you're using just the general profile sum that CropX gives you, you're going to see a higher full point. Good comment. Yeah, Ben.
Does the algorithm look back at full points from previous years and take that into account?
No.
No. And it's probably okay that it does not, because although if you're installing in a similar area, yes, your full point will be very similar year after year, but it's never going to be the same, right? Because every single point in the field is different. And so you're going to see little adjustments time over time. And so I think it's better insurance this way not to pull in history from previous years.
Yeah, or I'd say an even bigger influence is just the slight variations in your install. You're reading within plus or minus 5% of what you always were before, but it's going to be just a little bit different from install to install.
Let's do we want to hand the mic to, I want to make sure everyone can hear it. Thank you, Tim.
That question.
Well, just hold 1 minute till Tim gets you the, thank you.
Oh, thanks. I think that question might have been in reference to a permanent crop situation where the probe doesn't get uninstalled and reinstalled.
Good point.
So in that case, there is no, you're not really establishing a new graph at any point, because if you're in a permanent crop and you've installed the device, that graph is just going to keep continuing on. And so that logic just keeps working as time goes on.
Good comment. Yeah, Ben.
All right. Relating to the last graph that you showed, what would explain the VWC that was decreasing quickly in the first few hours after three increases, even if the field capacity wasn't reached?
Preferential flow would be most likely the answer. I mean, just because you see a wedding event that doesn't have a perfect level cap somewhere below refill or the full point doesn't mean that, you know, it was saturated and you lost water. Like if we zoomed out on this, I bet you're going to see an obvious previous event that's establishing that 7.3 inch high. You know, in a perfect world, are we going to see the July 11th event have a perfect level cap because it soaked up every molecule of water? Yes, but the reality is that it doesn't, and that you're going to have, you know, imagine the sensor and the hole and the tiny bit of water that may have accumulated during that wedding event around the sensor, and then maybe it sort of dissipates over time. I would say you'd probably see that a little bit more the heavier soil you get into. But yeah, hopefully that answers that question.
Okay, I think let's switch gears and just touch base on the moisture offset, since this is new within the last year.
Yeah, so launched in May. Initially, this feature is built to accommodate or give you the power to have an influence on that initial set point. And it's important for dry installs and giving you the tool to adjust that field capacity based on the conditions that you observed at the time of install. Now, we've sort of updated our approach to that to where we really want to push the user to let us decide. Yes, thank you. But we are giving you even more power going into the 2025 season than we had in the 2024 season. And the reason I say that is because we are giving you the power to make that offset adjustment at 3 different depths. Previously, there was only one input that you could provide. You could only give us a full optimal or refill. And the reason that that's important was because I think one of the things we observed was a lot of tendency to think things are kind of average, and the other tendency to probably make your input based off of what you see in the top portion of the profile. And the way that this works is that input used to affect every single sensor, individual sensor. And so it sort of inflated those field capacities on those bottom sensors. A little bit of jumping around, but that brings up a good point that hopefully everybody understands. All of what we've been talking about, all of this logic, all of the ability to identify these patterns, the actual algorithm is operating at the individual sensor level, not at the profile sum or the root zone sum. So each individual sensor is establishing its own full point, refill point, and wilting point. So that's how it's actually happening on the back end. In fact, some of you have probably seen this if you've gone in and looked at an individual sensor graph. And if you toggle all of them off except one, you'll actually see where those lines are set.
Questions on moisture offset? Yeah.
I was just gonna add on to that with this new feature on adding the current soil moisture. You know, like Nick Stahl said, last year was really challenging because it was really dry at the beginning of the year. And then we got a lot of heavy rainfalls right about the time we were installing. So it was really challenging for you guys to try to determine full, optimal, or refill. And typically what we had happen was everybody just put optimal, not knowing. And there's many reasons for that. So it's nothing that you guys did wrong or any of that, but I just want to say we don't want to overcomplicate or don't overthink this new feature where if you do want to manually input the different moisture levels at each depth, Taha mentioned this kind of pulled back from a crop metrics feature years ago, and all it was a simple kind of a input that when you're drilling that hole, it's usually very easy to tell what that moisture is like when you get to each depth and if there is change, so don't try to really worry about overanalyzing and really trying to figure out each individual depth. Just take that visual observation when you're drilling that hole and you'll see, if it's, for example, it might be dry at the top foot, optimal or medium in the middle, and very wet at the bottom, for example. But, just kind of keep that dry, medium, and wet, and don't overthink it with the full optimal and refill.
Great point. And again, we're not taking away the ability to let CropX decide. So if you're a beginner, if you don't even want to mess with this manual set point stuff, just let CropX decide. And I'm sure it'll do a fine job. Like I said, they're making plenty of improvements for the coming year. Any other questions on moisture offset? Okay. I did just want to throw this slide in here. This isn't anything new by any means, but I want to remind you that we do have the sensor, the physical sensor offset on that V4, the vertex. And the place where I would find this useful is in situations where you either have a hard pan or a compacted layer of soil that you cannot drill through, or you've never seen roots be able to break through. I would use that offset, or if you have a shallow rooted crop, this is just another good option to kind of help those set points along throughout the season. Anything to touch on?
I'll put this on my golf course. Yeah, my turf.
There you go. There you go.
I honestly prefer it as kind of my default. That's kind of my go-to. I like seeing moisture higher in the profile, so it's kind of a personal preference. Would you like your top sensor at 4, 6, or 8?
So, yeah,
Jason?
can someone run, sorry, the people on virtual cannot hear you if we don't have the mic.
I just had a quick question on those physical offsets. Is there any advantage in the early season as the roots develop at a shallow level? Is that advantageous to have that sensor higher?
That's why I like having it higher.
Yes.
You're going to see smaller wetting events that you otherwise may not see if that sensor is deeper. You're going to see roots develop quicker because they're going to grow from the top down. And yeah.
Okay, so manual adjustments of set points. Why would we do it? I meant to edit this basically because we have solved the problem of mostly of installing into dry soils. The case used to be before we could use a software to do the moisture offsets at the beginning. The auto set points would default to full, and that was a real issue in drought years. Just ignore that point. We're fixing it. Adjustments to refill throughout the season. I think about this especially when you're scheduling your last irrigation. That is a time when you will likely make manual adjustments to the set points. Another time I use them is during the critical crop growing stages. I think of tasseling and corn. That I do not like my growers to stress the corn by any means. So usually I will move that refill line up slightly and then bring it back down when I can tell the crops have slowed on the water use a little bit. Other times that you
No, all good.
Okay. And one thing I just want to point out too, just remember that the computer only has data from the second it's installed. So any of those wedding events, even if they happen 2 days prior, it doesn't know about that. So just keep that in mind when you're installing, manually setting set points, that sort of thing. Questions? Okay, I'm just going to go over a couple quick examples and I think we'll do some practice here. How to make manual adjustments. I think most of you know this, but on that profile sum graph, you just hit manage set points. It'll bring you to the screen. Shut off that auto update button, that image on the top left there. And you'll be able to enter in a new full point, a new refill point. You can also edit any history. Like basically, this is useful to backdate anything. And it's useful to look back and see what changes you've made over the season. And I just am showing on that bottom graph. I think this was a point for one of my growers when we were getting ready to schedule the last irrigation. So that was a time when I shut the auto set points off, excuse me, and I brought that refill line down slightly to use a little extra moisture in the profile. This is $1 million question. I wondered this for a very long time when I started working with sensors. I think you get asked this quite a bit. How do you pick a full point and how do you pick a refill point? Thankfully, with our software, it's a lot easier than it used to be. I think we've touched on picking a full point pretty well now, but refill point is still kind of up in the air. Let the sensor do it for you. But beyond that, if the grower doesn't like it or you think it needs to be adjusted, think about, these are just a couple of things to think about. So think about the crop. Every single crop is going to be different. Going out on a whim, strawberries are extremely sensitive to moisture stress. So they only have a management allowable depletion of like 20% versus corn or soy is going to be closer to like a 50%. So that's going to be a big deal when you're picking a refill point. Think about growth stage, like that example I talked about, in those critical times, whether it is a crop that you need to stress to get a certain outcome, or it's a crop that you don't want to stress because it's tasseling or whatever it might be. User preference. Some growers want to push their irrigators a little harder. They want to wait a little longer. Maybe they have conservation in mind. Maybe, they only have so many credits. So just that communication with your growers or your employees, whatever it might be. And then also scheduling of the last irrigation. That's a time when typically you bring that refill point down. Any other?
Yeah, that makes me think of one of the methods I use too. And going back to that bucket analogy, right? Okay, I've got my full point. Maybe the best question is not where the refill point is, but how long is my grower actually willing to wait
Yes.
before he's going to irrigate? Like, who cares where 75% depletion is if they're just going to turn it on 6 days after we're past full anyway? That's a good methodology. I guess the way I look at that is, soils with good water holding capacity, it's pretty normal for you to have at least 2 to 3 inches between your full and your refill point. And for most irrigation systems, applying between 0.7 and 1.2 inches at a time means that, if we're triggering that irrigation at that refill point, we're always going to have at least an inch, inch and a half of room in that profile at all times, even after irrigation. And what that means is we can take advantage of any rain that does come, and we're going to be able to store it in the soil for later use. You can't do that without a measuring tool.
Yeah, great point. To piggyback off of that, think about system capacity too. I know you've touched on it a couple times, but usually when that sensor reaches refill point, it doesn't mean that's the point that the pivot should be turned on, because some systems with lower well capacities, they take longer to get around. So if you have a grower that is in the mindset that I'm only going to turn my irrigation system on once I see that line hit refill, then we should probably be moving that refill point up to accommodate for that.
Yeah, or you got to make sure that that's part of your communication process that,
Yeah.
look, this does not mean this is when you start. This means when you need to be hitting the sensor location.
Okay, I just have a couple examples. So in this case, this was a field that experienced both some adjustments to the full point while set on auto. So it basically just real minor adjustments to the full point, nothing crazy, but the algorithm did recognize some with the new data as rain and irrigation events came in, some just slight adjustments there. And then you can see that the set points were shut off at the end of the season to start thinking about that last irrigation scheduling. Here, moisture offset feature was used. This grower was placed into that optimal right away as the season went on. Again, the full point was adjusted. They shut the auto set points off mid-season to accommodate for the critical growing stage at that point. Anything to add?
Yeah, just that first circle where you see the moisture in between field capacity and refill. So in that example, the installer selected that this field is at optimal. And I think we did a pretty darn good job. We had that initial field capacity adjusted upward, and later we proved it indeed was there or a little bit higher. So the feature worked well. That was the intended use.
Questions? Just showing the same thing. This grower was placed into optimal at the beginning of the season.
Yep, yeah. Basically just showing another example of the exact same phenomena. You've got an install input of optimum. And the reason I brought this one up here was because this situation was one where that initial point was the exact same point the whole season. There wasn't any additional ones identified. You could probably adjust that up. The algorithm didn't quite identify enough of a change there on that event in early July, but I think we did a pretty darn good job of setting that offset at the time of install to what the field conditions were. And what we later learned was indeed the correct input.
Threw this one on there, kind of a funky situation. Not really sure what happened here, but this is a situation where computers can fail us sometimes. The full point got adjusted real funky there for some reason. I'm not sure why. In this case, I would probably shut it off, at least for a couple weeks, and let it straighten out. I don't want anyone to be confused, whether it's employees or growers looking at the graphs. And then I would turn it back on, and as long as it's performing well, I'd leave it. So things to look out for as you are glancing at profile sums throughout the season. This is just kind of same. I'm going to skip over these, I think, and we will get to any questions before we switch over to practice for the last 15 minutes. Ben, anything on virtual? Okay.
Cool. QR code slide in here. Oops. All right, guys, I'm trying to get you your QR code here. We are going to do a similar activity to yesterday. It's not going to be a competition style.
60-second break. Stand up. Look alive. I'll call you back in a little bit. Yeah, don't move far, please. Don't like go outside this room.
Maybe I didn't any other. I started resharing a different screen. Is that coming through? Did you freeze the screen? Okay, cool.
Thank you.
I thought that was something I did. Okay. QR code. Everybody got it? Everybody got it? Anybody need it? You're going to like the practice, so it'll be worth it. Trust me.
Sounds like something a teacher would say, Nick. Maybe you should have gone and been a professor.
I don't think so. Okay.
You can just skip.
All right. As soon as I pulled that screen up, whoever was in the QR code, this should have popped up, right? Okay. That brings it up. What happens when you switch devices? All right. Well, switching gears, I'll just go through them one by one. Okay. Well, all right. You can all just yell out the answer. How about that?
Yeah, I've been trying to use a QR from yesterday, so that's likely why it looks different.
Yeah,
that's just-
something
we'll
else.
just
But
move
anyway,
on.
all right. So at the core of our app, we need to understand how this works. Right, Preston? Where's he at? He's not in here. All right. We have a sensor, and all of our sensors are reading 50%. That sensor is 26 inches deep. We got 26 inches of soil. How much water is in my profile? 13. Okay. Next. It'll show the answer slide and then, yeah. Okay. Hopefully be able to zoom in here, but okay, it's popping up now as you. Okay, cool. All right, so where would you set the full point on this graph? Can you zoom in on your phone? Well, pointer.
Yeah.
All right. This is 6.7, 7, 7.5, and 8. Yeah, so we just set the full point at 7.4. All right, now let's move on in our season. Same graph. Now, where would we set the full point? Pretend you're our wonderful algorithm. Little do we know there's actually just people in some office just setting these. No, it's not.
You want to read
That's
off?
not how this works.
Read off the left.
All right, so we've got 7, 7.5, 8, 8.5. Eight 8.3. Very good. What moisture offset was selected by the installer? Anybody? Optimal? Yes. Bingo. And we're seeing that because we've got the full point here, and it's the midpoint between the refill and the full. So we've got our current moisture, and that initial set point said, okay, the installer said we're at optimal. The full point's going to be up here. If I wanted the total water usage or infiltration for a certain period, how would I do that? So it's like, I want to know how much water usage is happening or how much infiltration I had. So I'm looking at my sum graph. How would I do that? Do I just like hover over it and then try to do some mental math? Do I just go, I don't know, that looks like 4,500s? Or do we use the ruler tool in CropX where you can draw this box and then it will calculate it for you and it'll say from this point to this point, you have a change of 1.2 inches or whatever. Sounds like a good idea. Sounds like a good idea to use. That's an existing feature. Yeah, I know. All right, another practice. What's the full point on this one? Different graph. We've got 8.5, 8.7, 8.9, 9.1. So initial full point would have been 8.9. Bingo. All right, same sensor, later time frame. Where are we at now? So again, 8, 8.5, 9, 9.5. Where do you think it would be? 9.3. You got it. Yep, another one. So now so that was our initial, and then our second one. Now we're going to establish an even higher third set point. So same graph. So here's 9, 10, and 11. Where do we think our true field capacity was on this field? Right there, about 10.5. Nailed it, yeah. Okay, so this question, which we talked about this earlier, can field capacity decrease? And without the funky answers, the answer is no, right? I mean, in general, you should not be seeing these full points adjust down like that. Somebody. Right, so going back to that definition of field capacity, right? Like our soil is not changing its physical properties during the season. Beyond some minor changes, in this example, we're seeing inches of change throughout the season. This needed to be set on manual and retain this initial full point, which, by the way, what did they select at install? Optimal. Was it an underestimation of the moisture in the profile? Yep, because we never established any new high, and we clearly had plenty of available water throughout, the rest of these wetting event and water uses. I just wanted more of a discussion question. What issues do you see with this graph? What suggestions would you have for the grower? What do you have? Overwatering? Our field capacity is up here. Anything? What else? This is a very heavy soil, and it's really kind of a strange thing to work with. We're clearly having good water use. We don't see any reduced water use like in the bottoms of these times before irrigation. So we were lowering these refill points. Once we got down here, we did see that happen. So we really were probably hurting at this point. So, I mean, the answer I guess I was looking for was we needed more water. I mean, that's really what it boiled down to. We got to a point in the season here, and this is only the middle of August, where we lost some yield. I mean, there's really no way around it. The scenario here was for the months of June, July, and August, they had 4 inches of rain total. Their average is 12 during that period. This poor guy was just unlucky this year, really. It kind of kept happening all around him. And the other thing that that makes this more challenging is this field shares a well. He's running 2 quarters off of the same already somewhat limited water supply. So we did the best with what we could.
Any questions? Tim, do you have, that is everything we have. So, okay. Thank you, guys.
All right. End of a long but interesting day. I hope you guys enjoyed the format. I lost count how many software updates Taha talked about in about 2 hours. It's got to be close to 30, I think, which was amazing. So just housekeeping again. I just looked outside. Of course it's raining. And of course it's going to stop about 6:15. So likely we're going to want to use the buses to get to where we're going. So again, first bus will leave at 5:45 and they'll just run down there, come back, take another load down. And then we can all get down there fairly dry, hopefully. Doesn't look like the rain's going to stay with us though. It's going to clear out. I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but there will be a return bus at 9 o'clock.